Hello and welcome everybody, I'm Joshino, and today I'm going to be talking about the release of Royale on Steam and pretty much launching it into an official early access. I'm going to be talking about a quick overview of what the game is currently. I'm going to talk about the actual release itself, what I think about how they've handled it, and I'm also going to go into a bit of the nitty-gritty on like a light review of the current gameplay and talk about some of the changes from what it originally was. Plus some thoughts on whether or not it can really break into the market, challenge Fortnite and PUBG, and ultimately if it deserves to. So quickly, Royale is the new Battle Royale game on the block. What sets it apart from other games? So it shares a similar vein in that there's a large map, you're dropping into it from the sky, you Hulk smash in Royale instead of parachute, then you're scrambling around trying to loot to find weapons, armor abilities, and fight to the death after this RNG loot box part, either with a squad, duo or solo, although they are currently switching between the modes. And there's a third-person shooter, however it differentiates itself by having a lot of the abilities that come from the original game Paladins, although since its original release, the abilities have been tweaked a lot to fit the new game a lot more, and also a third-person perspective. There's movement abilities like being able to fly through the air, leap into the air, roll across the ground. More offensive ones like being able to fire a fireball out. Then utility ones being able to fire a flare that can reveal enemies. Mine that tells you when people have gone past. Some stealth abilities. And also being able to build a turret. Now, these aren't too dissimilar from some of the Fortnite items like the impulse grenades, things like that, although this takes it to another level. And what even more differentiates it from Fortnite especially is the fact that it now has classes. Each of the classes has some unique elements, so they each have a class-specific bonus. For example, the warrior has a passive health regen, the mage gets more health from potions, things like that, and then also they have individual class-specific abilities. So when you pick up abilities after killing people or opening chests, these RNG, like at all the other Battle Royale games, you start off going around the map trying to pick up things out of chests, and inside them there's abilities, weapons. Some of those are class specific. From the chest it's the abilities, and there's a common pool of weapons, but then there's a single weapon for each of the classes that you can then forge at the Forge. So the Forge is another system that is completely different from other Battle Royale games, and that's in that there's a resource in the game that you craft with during the matches, and all duplicate weapons and weapons that you find on the floor that you don't want to pick up, you can use to dismantle and turn it into essence to forge with. And these forges are static points on the map. They're always the same in these points of interest type of things, and are quite focal points for fights as they show to enemies where you are forging, because there's a big plume of smoke coming out the top of the chimney. Coming back to the class-specific abilities, these also define each of the characters. Usually the class-specific ability is movement-oriented, like the mage. I think is probably my favourite at the moment, where you soar through the air. It's a repurposed version of the Eevee ability, and it's basically just like you fly and you can control it. And the warrior's leap, and also the hunter's dodge. Each class has one ability they can't change, these class specific ones, and then also two extra ones where they can fill with the ones that you can pick up around the map, although you can upgrade your main specific class ability if you find the upgrades up to legendary around the map too, or forge them. The class specific weapons too are rather interesting. The warrior has an axe, it's the old Grove axe, and it has quite a curved drop now, so it's a bit harder to use than it was before. Personally, my favourite is the hunter's bow, though. It's a repurposed Charlene's bow, but the UI and control is quite different to what it is in the original Paladins game, but it is very fun to play around with. With the classes and to some element the crafting, it almost plays a bit like a MMORPG on a Mopica, and that's also compounded by the mounting element, being able to get on your horse at any point. There is a little bit of a cooldown if you come straight off it, you can't get straight back on again, but basically you have access to a vehicle when you're going around the map, and that is in your mount, which is a relatively fast way of getting around. The map might be huge, but you actually move very fast. Something interesting with the game currently is that I was about to give criticism for the circles being too slow, the red circles, and the circles being too big, and actually it's being changed tomorrow in a hotfix. Alongside some of the other bugs, so they're actually fixing out, there's a animation bug where you can get stuck in a T-pose, which was rather silly, which is going out the window, which I think is great that they're so on top of the bug fixing at the moment. But that's also worth mentioning with the Hi-Rez games, and coming on to the release really and how it's come out. So Hi-Rez have a way with releasing games, so this is actually more like an alpha, in an alpha state that's come out. Like Paladins, originally it started with a closed alpha, although I think with Realm Royale it was almost hidden away, the original closed and then open alpha. There was a link that you could download the client from, but my fans said to me, Josh, is this link legitimate? Because it did look very dodgy, and I had it linked in my YouTube videos where I was showing off Realm Royale originally. And honestly, it came a bit out of left field that they were going to release Realm Royale onto Steam. There has been press releases, they have made a pretty awesome trailer which I showed at the start, but again I do wonder whether this was a bit of a rush release, and it's hard to gauge how well it is doing at the moment, being a closed alpha and only just coming out. Looking at the Steam charts, it's not making a huge splash at the moment. Newer games often make quite a big hit into the market. Currently the peak's around 11,500 players. There have been some quite big Twitch streamers that have picked up the game and played it. I saw Forzen was playing it yesterday and he was really enjoying it, and he had like 15,000 people watching him at that point, which I guess would have probably dragged people on. But being a game from Hi-Rez, it is probably in for a relative long haul. It's not just going to go out of the window straight away. Unlike with the hotfixes, there's going to be a lot of additions pretty hard and fast, so as long as it can capture just a chunk of people, then because of the patch cycle, likely there'll be content to be talked about on a quite often basis, and might be able to keep capturing people as they go along, a bit like they did with Paladins. Again, I'm not so sure on the surprise releases and sort of the weird closed alphas and doing it this way, but one of the good things about the game is they have released it in early access, but they've actually not got any monetization whatsoever in it at the moment. I'm not gonna lie, most early access games now are trying to sell at least skins. Maybe blue boxes in there, but there's absolutely nothing at the moment. There are tabs ready in the game in the menu. There's a Battle Pass tab, and there's a tab for your customizations. Actually, the only customization that's listed is changing your chicken, which actually is funny because the newer version of the Realm Royale has music when you get turned into a chicken. It almost like tries to pump up your adrenaline as you try and escape somebody. So unlike other Battle Royale games, well, some sort of similarly, you get downed even if you're solo, but when you're downed you turn into a chicken instead, and you're slightly harder to hit because your actual hitbox is smaller, but you are slower, so it's still quite difficult to get away, but you do actually have a chance in this game. But that's actually quite funny music that plays whilst you turn into a chicken, which I'm going to guess is they'll customize at some point. Hi-Rez is actually relatively good at doing the free-to-play model. There was a blip with Paladins where they introduced gamer-facing items, and then that was repealed after about a month and a half, and it didn't really work out. And after that point, they said that they would never try that again, seeing as it had such harm. And that was a wake-up call for them with this game as well, with Realm Royale. So hopefully, we'll only be seeing skins at some point in the near future. But for now, it's completely free. There's no monetization in the game, so you're playing it in its purest form. And on that note, they have actually made it so that each of the classes is unique, it's distinct. A lot of people were asking for female characters. Well, now the mage and the ranger are both female. Have pretty good models. I think they actually look really good. I like the style going on, and the map is rather beautiful. There are some elements that don't quite mesh together as well. So there's like sort of the eastern themed area. Some of it just doesn't seem to mesh with the ground texture, I don't think. I don't know how to explain it exactly, but it just doesn't look quite right. It is nice as water features as well. Once you go into the water, there's no sort of animation, there's no splashing or anything, so it's a bit awkward too. And then there's some just random areas that have had less attention than other ones. The cities generally look good, but then some areas outside of that, in sort of canyons and things, don't look so great just because they're so barren. Although apart from looks, the actual map design and the sort of areas you can fight in are very diverse. There's very diverse areas of height and different levels inside of buildings, and the map is pretty massive, and there's a lot of different terrain to fight around that will keep you interested during a match. And hopefully now that the circle was made smaller, there'll be more action during the mid-game, where before you'd be sort of just rolling a dice as to whether you'd find somebody or not, which isn't quite as fun as just pushing in and being pushed in towards the forges, because it currently works out that you keep going in and in on the map, keep going to each of the forges, you're looting as you go, and then trying to craft the best, because you get the legendary armor in there, legendary abilities, and legendary weapon in there. So basically you can get all the best stuff from the forges, so you're trying to always get to a forge after you've tried to loot as much as possible and get the essence together, the crafting resource. Realm Royale does have the benefit of a lot of the mechanics coming from Paladins, the gunplay especially. It feels relatively tight for an early access game, and honestly, bugginess wise, there isn't too much bugginess in Realm Royale for an early access, and for an early access this early on is little things like talk about the T-posing, but that's actually being patched out. And although there may be some desync in my footage, it's more because I'm currently in Taiwan in Computex, and the ping isn't as good because there's not an Asian server, which is something else to come on to. So part of the reaction on Steam with the reviews has been negative because there's no C server, there's no Brazilian server, so a lot of people aren't happy at the moment about that. Although the actual reviews about the game are all pretty much positive, and the only reason it's sort of dipped down to mostly positive rather than very positive, which it started out on, is because the servers aren't there, which again is kind of on Harris's back for not having that in place. But for the most part, the response to the game is actually positive. Also, most of the media is positive towards the game as well, although there are some confusing messages about it being a Fortnite clone. Although this game pretty much shares its aesthetic with Paladins, and the actual gameplay is rather different and has its own flavour compared to Fortnite, minus the building as well. I know that a lot of people don't actually like the building in Fortnite so much, so that sort of focuses more on the abilities and the gunplay, so it might be a genuine option for people. But then again, the clone comments could also be positive in some ways, being compared to Fortnite, obviously being the most popular. Other people might be more interested in it, so there's always a positive and a negative from that, but also it does confuse the game a bit when it is actually its own experience. I will say that some of the balancing, I think, is slightly out with some of the abilities, like the leap and then the charge with the warrior can get you not so about a tenth of the map in one go if you combo them together, because you jump far and then you sort of propel yourself. And that doesn't sound that far, but actually the map's huge, so you can go a huge distance with that. And I think that the warrior as well, because they have the health regen, the axe is very powerful, and because you've got so much mobility, you can get close to people, close enough that the axe always works out well, and you can use close quarters weapons. So I just think that maybe the balance isn't quite right yet, although honestly most of them seem to have pros and cons, and I've had a lot of fun with the gameplay at the moment, and I'm sure that's going to be tweaked over time and something they work on. But also the over-the-topness of the abilities in this game is what sets it apart as well, just because some of the things are so ridiculous and some of the movement abilities are so ridiculous when they get to the legendary level, and it's just fun to play around with. It's just like being in a big sandbox where you can just sort of derp around in. And on the point of the game changing, it's another one of the things where there's positives and negatives, because the game could be very, very different from what it is currently in the early access to what it'll actually end up in, and maybe even in a month or even a few weeks it might completely change to something different. I think that it has gotten a lot better than the original Realm Royale that came out, although I did actually like the Paladins Battlegrounds that came before it, where it had the actual Paladins characters, and it was an actual hero shooter Battlegrounds game, a Battle Royale game. And when it first went to the Realm Royale, it wasn't actually that buggy compared to, say, Radical Heights, which came out, which was quite messy. And even PUBG was messy when it first came out, and same with H1Z1. Realm Royale was relatively stable and worked well just because I think they had all the systems in place from Paladins. Now the game itself is a lot more fleshed out with the classes and lots more abilities and a lot more weapons being put into the game. and it all is coming together and working. Also, it seems they've really improved the frame rates, especially dropping in and things like that. I'm currently on the laptop. It's a good laptop, it's got 1060 in it, but it's not quite up to the scratch of my old system at home with the 1080 in it, a desktop 1080, and I was getting above 100 FPS on this, even when recording with OBS. Most of the time, it just seemed to be buttery smooth with no issues at all. Anyway, in closing, do I think that it can really challenge Fortnite? Well, probably not, just because it's such a huge giant, and Fortnite's captured people outside of the normal gaming sphere and really dragged people in because of the links to musicians and more non-gaming celebrities and things, and has become kind of bigger than a game. I don't think it's necessarily a great thing that one game has such power in the marketplace, but I don't think it's going to collapse anytime soon. And whilst Realm Royale might get quite a big following, I don't think it'll get quite there. Although it has a hell of a lot of potential, I just don't think that there's the marketing behind it. And in some ways it's kind of more niche than Fortnite is. But it does have a genuine argument in the fact that there's no building element in there, and it has this more class-based, almost MMO feeling experience with the mounting and things like that, and the general map feel and the fantasy aesthetic over sort of the more modern gameplay in Fortnite. Anyway, as always, be sure to let me know all of your thoughts in the comment section below about Realm Royale. I personally think it's come a long way. It's hard to mark and grade a early access game, although I think I'd give it a 7. The gameplay is a solid 8. There's some bugs which will knock it down a point, and it's still not completely finished. What would you mark it out of 10? Be sure to let me know in the comment section below. And if you enjoyed the video, hit the like button, subscribe for all my content, and hit that bell icon to become part of the notification squad. Until next time, Joshino.